Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm going to try to touch on a couple different subjects in the pantheon of bronchial thermoplasty, especially after following such an excellent talk. So let me see what I can expand upon. As you know, and we all do know, but for maybe some people in the audience who just walked in, this is an add-on therapy for those that are being currently treated with maximal medical management. It's a procedure, obviously, designed to deliver thermal energy to preferentially destroy the smooth muscles and possibly also denervate the lungs. It's 3 separate outpatient procedures. It's complementary, as we said, and it's meant to improve asthma control. It is not a bronchodilator. The RF generator system, as you see there on the right, is attached into this small catheter that the energy is directly applied. One of the things that I always found interesting, and we were very early jumping into this, the initial data on showing how thermoplasty worked, not the clinical data, the pathologic data, was always done in dogs, except dogs don't have asthma. And so proving that you could destroy the smooth muscle in an animal without asthma seemed pointless. So one of the things that we were very happy to start off in the beginning was what happens in actual people. So this is one of our first cases, a gentleman who responded dramatically to bronchial thermoplasty, had been on chronic prednisone of 30 milligrams his whole last 5 years and has now been on 0. As you'll see, the biopsies on the left were pre-thermoplasty. He was a gentleman who had peripheral eosinophilia. Thick, smooth muscle on the trichrome stain, post-thermoplasty, of course, loss of the smooth muscle. The trials that brought thermoplasty to market, or at least set things up, the first 3, I will go through those real briefly. We'll talk ever so briefly about AIR 2, because it's obviously been out for some time, and instead would prefer to then talk more about the current ongoing PAS2 study, as well as some data on outlying patients. SOTA, and I guess I'll put this slide back up here for 1 second. So the ATS-ERS guidelines on bronchial thermoplasty still listed as experimental and should be part of registries. And I take real offense at that, given the quantity of patients and the quality of the literature. If you look at the impact factor of where all the bronchial thermoplasty material has been published, this is a well-researched, well-understood clinical device. Yes, we still have tons of questions, but to label this as something that's investigational, I think, is offensive. Gina at least gets it right and talks about it as where it belongs, as an add-on therapy. Okay, the original 3 trials, to summarize the results, they were obviously small, though the AIR 1 was relatively larger. You'll notice that the key factors, improvement in quality of life scores, which is the whole reason we're here, right? We are respiratory physicians. We have patients with severe asthma. We watch them suffer. There is no worse feeling than not being able to catch your breath. And you see these folks improve in their quality of life. That right there is one of the most exciting things. Reduction in exacerbations, etc., also exciting. That all led to the AIR 2 trial, which demonstrated at the 1-year mark, as you see here, in roughly 80% of patients, a large improvement in quality of life. To put it into context, because AQLQ is definitely more of a research tool than a clinical tool. An AQLQ score going up by 0.5 is considered significant. So the fact that it went up 1.35, in the words of Dr. Juniper, who actually made the AQLQ score, that was her research, she says the highest she's ever seen. To put it into context, the salmeterol fluticasone combination inhaler that we all frequently use for our patients, that improves the AQLQ by 1. And the fluticasone alone by 0.55. So though those are great drugs, the degree of quality of life improvement using this scale is hard to compare. The other thing, of course, is, and this was the big take home, the reduction in exacerbations, the reduction in ER visits, and the reduction in missed work days or school days. Again, arguing for where the quality of life comes in. Now, I too would love to be able to know exactly who will respond so that I could avoid doing the procedure on those who have no chance of responding. But I guess I would also make the argument that I would love to know who exactly will respond to mepolizumab, because I don't see a 100% response rate when I start that drug. and I don't see a 100% response rate when I start omalizumab. So I don't understand also where the barrier for thermoplasty continues to be this desire that if we can't figure out who it works on, we're not going to do it, and yet we freely give away biologics. I think most importantly from BT was the safety data. I was taught early in my training that you can't do bronchoscopy on asthmatics. Being the kind of person who didn't listen well, I started bronching asthmatics and found out, of course, that like a lot of things that are dogma, that's all it was. And then it turns out you can safely bronch asthmatics, you can do things to them, and they will also do very well. This is a very well-tolerated procedure. Not surprising, there's an acute worsening of symptoms immediately after the procedure. I think that really telling is when you ask the patients, hey, would you probably or definitely recommend it to a friend or family member, and would you have it done again? The blue is, would you do it again? And the green is, would you tell others? If you can go through 3 separate procedures and come out the other side saying this is pretty darn good, I think that also speaks volumes. So those were all the trials that we knew of. I'm going to show the 5-year data, but I also want to highlight the PAS-2 study. Because one of the well-founded criticisms of the AIR-2 study was though it was labeled as severe, it all depends on how you want to slice the word severe. There were definitely some patients in that trial that weren't so severe. So the PAS-2 study was mandated by the US FDA to do a follow-up study of another 284 patients followed for 5 years. Essentially a replica of the AIR-2 trial. And the first published manuscript was at the 3-year mark, and then I'm going to show you data that was presented at one of the meetings recently. But I think the key here, it was designed to be a little bit more real world. That almost 95% of the patients definitively met the definition of severe asthma. But also compared to the AIR-2 study, it was a slightly older population with a higher BMI, worsening rates of severe exacerbations and hospitalizations, and an increased use of steroids. Designed to definitely be a sicker population. The published 3-year data is as here, that's the blue dots, and the comparator of the AIR-2, which is the red triangles. And as you can see, it parallels exactly severe exacerbations, ER visits, hospitalization rates. There's an ongoing decline in hospitalization rates over the years. Echoing 2 things. 1, despite being sicker, we see similar results to what was published in AIR-2. And 2, that these results are sustained and even continue on and sometimes even get even further improvement. Because of course the effect on the smooth muscle is indeed permanent. Now this data has not been peer reviewed, but this was presented last May at the American Thoracic Society meeting. This is the 4-year data. And what you'll notice on the severe exacerbation rate, year 4 looks a lot like year 3, again, paralleling to the AIR-2. This is also a number of exacerbations per subject in that 4-year mark. ER visits as well as hospitalizations. So though the 5-year data will be presented this year, I don't think it's going to take a great leap of faith to expect what the 5-year data will look like. It will probably honestly just be an extension of these curves. The AIR-2 did have an extension study. The idea was after the 1-year mark, and they had that decline, what ultimately happened? Was there durability of effect? Was there a reduction in exacerbations? And indeed there was. Now people will ask, why don't the exacerbations go to 0? And I have the same question, but I would argue and answer it in 2 separate ways. One, as we know, we don't obviously go out to the extremely small airways. And asthma is very much a small airways disease, though bulk of our symptoms come from the larger airways. But 2, this is still an underlying inflammatory disease. Thermoplasty has some, as I'll show you later, effect on inflammation, but not all. And so we frequently are using this as part of our toolbox of getting people under asthma control. The other thing, the 5-year data show that reduction in severe exacerbations is maintained both as event rates and percentage of patients. Same also with ER visits and the ER visit event rate. The patients who respond maintain that response. Also important, from the very beginning, so I was fortunate enough to be very early on in some of the initial meetings as studies were being designed. And one of the fears we all had long term was the possibility of bronchiectasis developing. And if you've ever wondered why we don't treat the right middle lobe, it was exactly that reason. The fear that the right middle lobe, which is so prone to bronchiectasis anyway, that we would induce it. So the 5-year data said, no, we don't. And I just recently reviewed all the CT scans at the 10-year mark. So there's 10-year follow-ups now from the AIR2 trial. And I reviewed all the CTs as well as one of the radiologists. And there's no increase in bronchiectasis or other findings at the 10-year mark. That data is being put together, but I was told I could share it. So there it is. I just couldn't put it in a slide. So we have at least 10-year CT data. The other thing is all the other original trials had 5-year data, as we showed here, and this was published in our review in Chest. There's a consistency, as you see, no matter how we slice and dice the type of patient or what was done over time. ER visits continue to drop and stay dropped. Respiratory adverse events. FEV1 remains stable. And I said this yesterday during the session on thermoplasty, but I want to throw this out as a hypothesis. And please, it is just a hypothesis. I have not proof. So before anyone yells at me for saying this, notice the FEV1s over the years here. These are chronic obstructed asthmatics. We all know the natural history of this disease. They continue to get more obstructed. Inhaled steroids do not alter the natural history of this disease. So I'll throw out as a hypothesis, one that I'm excited to see 10-year data on, that we are potentially disease modifying by ablating the smooth muscle, because in that limited window, we're not seeing realistic declines in FEV1. And it's just a hypothesis. I welcome you to join me in the fun, though, of figuring this out. Now, as was stated earlier in the last talk, there was no phenotyping during the AIR2 trial. Phenotyping actually was at that time considered a novel concept and was just making its way into the literature. So we can go back retrospectively and just say, are you allergic or non-allergic, for whatever that means, from the AIR2 data? This was the question in the study. I think more importantly, though, when you look at exacerbations or ER visits, whether someone was, quote, allergic or not allergic, you see similar outcomes. And it's exactly why when we talk about thermoplasty and where it belongs position-wise, we have a wide range of latitude. In this era of biologics, if a patient's a candidate for biologics, they are indeed a candidate for BT. And there may be various reasons to use the biologics first, that's fine, but you have BT still as an option. The question is also, can you do it on sicker patients? This came up on the last talk as well. So right at the very beginning, when we opened our BT shop, every single patient sent to us were patients that were way too sick for the AIR2 study. So we simply published that we did it safely. But then we went together with a group of other centers and put together a couple hundred patients who had all been too sick. They would have never been allowed to be in AIR2, and just to see if it's safe. So the inclusion criteria was FEV1 below 60, age over 65, 3 or more hospitalizations, other immunosuppressive therapies like methotrexate, and a history of being intubated. You could have any of that. You were allowed to be, sort of jokingly, you were allowed to be an asthmatic disaster, and we were going to do thermoplasty on you anyway. And the question was it safe? Well, here's the safety. Most of it done under general anesthesia, half of it, just from a perspective of what kind of procedure. It means obviously the rest were under conscious. 13% got admitted overnight for observation. Oral corticosteroids around the procedure, every single person, that's per protocol. And then a complication within 24 hours is defined as worsening of asthma symptoms or need to get an x-ray or other things like that, 5.9%. Your own experience with BT will tell you that this parallels exactly what you've seen with more milder patients. No one died. Despite every one of these patients being someone who was considered super high risk, nobody died. The hospitalization rate, though, was definitely higher. This is a sicker population. There's also clearly the bias, though, of all of us, that if you're a sicker patient and we're doing something to you, I have a lower threshold to admit you. So there are principles. This was a nice article published about 3 years ago by Dr. Castro and Dr. Blaze and Foggs and Peneteri on guiding principles. And they basically tell us and remind all of us that oral steroids is the enemy here, on top of obviously the asthma, but that use of oral steroids is a necessity at times. We have no choice. But when you have other options, we should be always finding a way to get people off of oral steroids or avoid needing them. Phenotyping is important. And in someone who's definitely a non-allergic, non-eosinophilic, BT is the preferred therapy. But it's an alternative across the other spectrums. They have a nice graph that basically shows that the BT cuts across all of the areas. So as more and more biologics come out, it's great to have more and more tools. But it's also nice to know that in the end, we have one tool that when you look at the economics of it, as expensive as the therapy is, it is better than the yearly expensive therapy. I'll skip this for the sake of time, other than just simply to throw out the protocol that we use at our institution. I'm not saying it's correct. It's not been validated, but our approach is we look for a lot of things that some people consider rare, but they're not pretty rare in the severe asthma population. We do a high-res CT. We've found several other mimicking disorders, full pulmonary function test, all the asthma questionnaires, a lot of blood work, very much talk about adherence. We'll actually call the pharmacy for records of your refills. We also bring in other consultants, and we will consider diagnostic bronchoscopy if there is any debate about your disorder. And we will take endobronchial biopsies and lavage if necessary, because as we all know, there's a large list of other disorders. But like I said at the beginning, this is all about helping people. So I'm going to just share you one email from a patient of mine who we had done thermoplasty on. And she said, I wanted to update you on my health. A year ago, I could not walk about 200 feet. After thermoplasty, I took a vacation to the Grand Canyon 2 weeks ago and was able to walk 5 miles. I know, I hear the buzzer. And we were 10,000 feet above sea level, something we'd always wanted to do. So the mechanism of action, I'll be very brief, I promise. One of the things that we've always been interested in is, in the Shakir group and others as well, what happens? What they demonstrated is, as you have a reduction in exacerbations, you can also correspond that to the reduction in the amount of airway smooth muscle. Our group took multiple biopsies, and we see the airway smooth muscle markers decline over time in the same area repetitively as you keep biopsying. What I found interesting, and what we all found interesting, was that multiple inflammatory markers decline, and markers of apoptosis continue to rise 6 weeks after you've already done thermoplasty to that area. Peripheral eosinophil counts also decline. Smooth muscle has been historically thought to be the passive component of asthma, but it plays an active role if you talk to the airway smooth muscle people. So manipulating the airway smooth muscle directly is potentially having a bigger picture effect. This was also mimicked in the Asthmatherm study, where they demonstrated reduction in airway smooth muscle, improved asthma control with a near correlation. And with that, I will say thank you. If you're ever in Chicago, let me know. CHEST will be in Chicago this year. These are the 2 ways to reach me, and I am on WhatsApp. If I can ever help, or if people would like copies of these slides. These are the abbreviated version. I do have about 140 slide deck on bronchial thermoplasty that is mine, and anyone's welcome to it. Just email me in and I'll send you the link. And happy to entertain any questions. I'm sorry I went over. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kyle. That was a lovely and very enlightening talk.
Thank you.
Just a small question for you from me. In your experience of bronchial thermoplasty over 10 years, what would be the lowest FEV1 that you would consider as, now considering you have extended data with more severe patients, what would be the lowest FEV1 that you would say I would not do BT on?
We don't have one. So I'll tell you, the very first patient we did, the first clinical, once the studies were done, we bought the machine. We're getting ready to do our first case. Her FEV1 was 33% of predicted. She was a lifelong asthmatic. Actually, she lives in the U.S., but she's actually of Indian descent. And we didn't tell the company, because once we told them afterwards, and they all the blood left their face. They were terrified. She did fantastic. She actually used to go from 6 exacerbations a year to 0. The woman has not been on steroids now for 10 years. She's been inhaled, but no oral steroids. It was life-changing. And she works in a hospital, so she works in a clean environment, so it wasn't an allergic component. She had the narrowest airways we've seen on any of our patients and the thickest smooth muscle on record in our whole biopsy cohort. We've done a patient with an FEV1 of 25% of predicted. Part of it is we have a very good working relationship with our anesthesiologists. They've learned to communicate with us. We communicate with them. We work very quickly when we're doing all these cases. So same with our bronchoscopic lung volume reductions. We carry the people through. We've had, in all the years now that I've been doing this clinically, we've never had anyone get intubated again. We had one laryngospasm, which was it was clear to me that the patient was being liberated too quickly from the vent. They're all extubated in the bronch suite right after the procedure. And we've taken to doing more and more LMAs as well, but I leave that at the discretion of the anesthesiologist. They all have a lot of GERD, so most of them don't want an LMA. So far, if you meet the criteria, we haven't found a patient to say no to. But I will tell you this, I get sent a ton of patients for thermoplasty, and I reject about half of them, because for that workup, what we find, of course, lack of adherence, alternative diagnoses. We frequently find a lot of these bad asthmatics are actually moderate asthmatics, but that are, a couple examples, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, no one ever did imaging, or we find sarcoidosis, or we have found several alpha-1 antitrypsin deficient patients, et cetera, et cetera. You find alternative, things that are so-called rare, but they're not that rare in the severe asthma population. So that group, obviously, we treat the other underlying disorder, and the asthma gets better. The remainder, of course, are bad asthma. And for me, it's all about asthma control. So if your ACT score, for example, is quite low, and we do thermoplasty, and it improves dramatically, but still not enough, then you're not under control, and I will add a biologic, assuming it's appropriate, et cetera. I only care about asthma control. That's the only coin of the realm.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Maybe we can just take a couple.
And I'll be around for a while.
I think you all can reach out to him during the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.